Julian Carter had spent the entire day fighting through boardroom politics, fielding calls from investors, and holding together a company that never seemed to rest. His penthouse was supposed to be his fortress, a place where the world's noise couldn't follow him. But that night, as he stepped out of his study, he felt something unusual: silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a silence that felt deliberate, like the air itself was holding its breath. His steps quickened down the hallway until he reached the nursery. The door was half open, warm light spilled across the carpet, and there inside the crib's soft glow was a man Julian had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, the sleeves of his shirt neatly rolled to his forearms. He cradled Julian's 8-month-old son with a gentleness that didn't match his imposing frame. A small bottle was tilted to the baby's lips, and the boy who usually fought every nap, who could cry for hours, was lying still, eyes half closed, tiny fingers curled around the man's thumb as if anchoring himself. Julian froze. Every instinct screamed to step forward, to take his child back. But something stopped him. It wasn't fear. It was the steady, unhurried way the man's chest rose and fell, the low hum of his voice barely above a whisper, the kind of sound meant to keep nightmares away. When Julian's voice finally cut through the quiet, it was sharper than he intended. The stranger looked up, eyes calm, posture steady, as if he had nothing to hide. He spoke only his name and one explanation: that he was sent by a childcare agency, told Julian needed someone urgently tonight. Julian's mind raced. He didn't recall making such a request. He didn't trust the ease with which this man stood in his home. And yet, the sight before him didn't feel like a breach. It felt like an answer to a question he hadn't dared to ask. The baby's breathing was even, his face untroubled, his small hand gripping tighter each time the man shifted his hold. Julian had built his empire on control, on never allowing variables he couldn't account for. But here at Diamond, in the glow of the nursery lamp, something in his chest softened. He could have demanded the child back, called security, ended this moment before it began. Instead, he stayed where he was, held in place by a truth he didn't want to admit: that this stranger, in just a few minutes, had given his son something Julian himself had been struggling to provide: the feeling of safety. It's strange how life can pull you sideways when you think you've drawn the map. Sometimes, the people who arrive without warning are the ones you end up needing the most. And as Julian stood there watching the rise and fall of his son's small chest, he realized that not every answer comes dressed in certainty. Some arrive in the form of a stranger holding your child like they belong. If you believe in stories where chance encounters can change everything, where the unexpected can become the foundation of something lasting, stay with Heart's story, because this night was only the beginning. Julian had never been the type to invite people into his private life. Business deals, public appearances, charity galas. Those were calculated spaces where every detail could be managed. His home, and especially the small life he had sworn to protect, was off limits. After his former partner walked away without warning, leaving behind the boy they had chosen together, Julian built walls so high that even the kindest offers of help were met with suspicion. Yet somehow, Ethan stood here in the center of his most guarded space, and those walls had not been enough to keep him out. He studied the man with the quiet caution of someone used to weighing risk before trust. Ethan's presence was steady, but unforced. He didn't crowd the room or try to fill the silence with meaningless comfort. He simply adjusted the baby in his arms, brushing a small curl from the child's forehead, as though the gesture was second nature. Julian's mind searched for a reasonable explanation. Why would someone with such skill in caring for children work a temporary night job? The question finally escaped him, and Ethan's answer came with a small, knowing smile. He spoke about raising his own son alone, starting when the boy was only 3 months old. There was no drama in his voice, no attempt to make the story heavier than it already was. Just a simple truth: there had been no one else to do it. So he learned. Those words lingered in the air. Julian had lived in a constant state of tension, juggling the demands of being a CEO with the endless needs of a child too young to understand why one of his parents had disappeared. Most nights, he went to bed with the feeling that he was failing at something, either at business, at fatherhood, or at keeping himself from breaking under the weight of both. Hearing Ethan speak so plainly about endurance, about the refusal to collapse when a child depends on you, stirred something unspoken inside him. It was not admiration in the way Julian admired other men for their power or their success. This was different. It was the quiet recognition of someone who had lived through the same unglamorous hours rocking a crying baby at dawn, calculating grocery budgets alongside mortgage payments, making decisions with no one to share the burden. It was the awareness that this man understood, not in theory, but in the marrow of his bones, what it meant to be the only safe harbor for a small life. Julian realized then that his unease wasn't entirely about Ethan's sudden appearance. It was about how easily this stranger had crossed into a place he had kept locked for so long, the place where vulnerability lived. That was the part of him he had been trying to shield, even from himself. The baby stirred, letting out a small sigh before settling back into the crook of Ethan's arm. Julian could see the faint lines of fatigue on Ethan's face, the kind only years of responsibility could carve. And in those lines, there was no bitterness, only proof that love, when given without condition, demands everything and still asks for more. In that moment, Julian understood something he had been resisting. Strength wasn't about how much control he could keep. Sometimes, it was about letting another person stand beside him in the work, even if that person's presence felt dangerously close to his guarded heart. Trust, he thought, is rarely a single leap. It's a series of small choices, each one a test of courage. And tonight, for reasons he couldn't yet name, he had taken the first step. The apartment had settled into the kind of stillness that only comes after a child has drifted into deep sleep. The nursery light was dimmed, the hum of the city beyond the glass softened by thick curtains. Julian sat in the living room, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hands, his thoughts circling the stranger who had arrived hours earlier and the unexpected calm that had followed. Then the knock came. It wasn't tentative or polite. It was sharp, urgent, a rhythm that carried intention rather than request. Julian's chest tightened. Few people knew where he lived, and none arrived without calling first. Setting the mug down, he moved to the door, his hand hovering over the handle for a beat longer than usual. When he opened it just enough to see outside, two men stood in the hallway. Their suits were outdated, creased in places that spoke of long hours and low care, but their eyes were alert, scanning past him into the space behind. They introduced themselves as representatives, their voices carrying the artificial politeness of people masking a threat. They were there, they claimed, about an old debt, one belonging to Julian's former partner, a sum that by law had nothing to do with him. The words were rehearsed, but the way their gaze slid toward the hallway leading to the nursery made their real intent clear. Julian felt a pulse of anger rise. The urge to shut the door, to call building security, to keep this ugliness out of his home, surged through him. But before he could move, a shadow crossed the edge of his vision. Ethan had stepped silently from the hallway, his posture no longer relaxed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move forward. Yet something in his stance shifted the easy caretaker, replaced by a presence that commanded space. His words were low, clipped, and absolute. They had 3 seconds to leave. It wasn't bluster. There was an edge to his tone that suggested experience, a quiet authority that made the air between them heavier. The two men hesitated, their smirks faltering. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without another word, they turned and walked down the hall. Their retreat as quick as their arrival had been loud. The echo of their footsteps faded into the hum of the elevator, leaving behind a silence of a different kind, one laced with the aftertaste of a threat narrowly avoided. Julian closed the door and locked it, the sound of the bolt sliding home louder than it should have been. He turned toward Ethan, questions pressing at the edge of his mind, but the man had already shifted his focus back toward the nursery, listening for any sign that the baby had been disturbed. Satisfied that the child still slept, He stepped back into the room, his movements calm, deliberate, as though the confrontation had been no more than swatting away a passing storm. Julian lingered in the doorway, watching him. In the business world, power was often about display numbers, titles, influence. But what he had just witnessed was something else entirely. This was protection without expectation, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition because its purpose is clear. In that moment, Julian felt an unfamiliar blend of gratitude and unease. Gratitude for the safety Ethan had ensured, unease at the realization that sometimes, no matter how capable or guarded you believe yourself to be, you cannot stand alone. Strength, he began to understand, is not only measured by what you can face on your own, but by knowing when to let another person face it beside you. The hours after the confrontation passed with an almost deliberate quiet, as if the apartment itself was recovering from the sudden disruption. Julian stood near the wide windows, the city lights spilling across the polished floor, trying to reconcile the unease of what had just happened with the unexpected steadiness in his home. He had always prided himself on handling problems alone, believing that relying on someone else meant exposing a weakness. But tonight had shown him another truth sometimes. Another person's presence could change the course of events without asking permission. Ethan was in the nursery again, leaning slightly over the crib, his hands resting lightly on the railing as he watched the baby breathe. There was no urgency in his posture, no sign that he needed acknowledgement for what he had done earlier. When Julian finally spoke to thank him, Ethan didn't respond with the usual dismissal people give when they want to appear modest. Instead, his voice was even, deliberate, and entirely without pretense. He said he wasn't there for Julian. He was there for the child, because the boy deserved to feel safe, even in sleep. The words landed with a weight Julian wasn't prepared for. His entire adult life had been spent in spaces where every act had a price. Every favor carried a hidden cost. Trust was transactional. Care was often conditional. And yet, here was someone who spoke as though a child's peace was reason enough to act without calculation, without seeking reward. Julian found himself listening more than speaking, drawn into the stories Ethan shared about his own son, nights when the boy had been sick and sleep was impossible, days when exhaustion had made the world seem heavier. Yet the thought of quitting never once crossed his mind. These were not grand victories or extraordinary achievements. They were the quiet, unglamorous moments that defined a parent's love, the kind no one applauds for, but without which a child cannot grow whole. In those stories, Julian recognized pieces of his own struggle, the silent battles fought at dawn when the city was still dark, the moments of doubt hidden behind boardroom confidence, the way responsibility could be both an anchor and a compass. The difference was that Ethan spoke of these experiences without resentment. There was no bitterness in his tone, only the matter-of-fact acceptance that this was what love required. Standing there by Noah, Julian realized how rarely he let himself feel small in a way that wasn't tied to failure. But in Ethan's presence, he didn't feel diminished, he felt human. And it struck him that perhaps there was a strength in letting someone else see that humanity. The baby stirred, releasing a soft sigh before curling back into stillness. Ethan glanced at Julian briefly, then back at the crib, as if to remind him where his focus truly lay. Julian understood the message without it being spoken. In a life driven by deadlines, valuations, and the next strategic move, there was a different kind of wealth, one not counted in accounts or assets. It lived in moments like this, a child's steady breathing, the quiet assurance of protection, the rare company of someone whose care could not be bought. And in that understanding came an unspoken lesson. Value is not measured by what can be taken or spent, but by what remains when everything else is stripped away. Morning light crept across the nursery walls, soft and golden, washing away the sharp edges of the previous night. Julian stepped into the room expecting to find Ethan already gone, but the man was still there, sitting in the armchair near the crib. His posture was relaxed, yet his gaze was fixed on the child with the quiet attentiveness of someone memorizing a moment. It was then Julian noticed the small, worn photograph in Ethan's hand. Ethan hesitated before speaking, as though deciding whether this was the right time or if there was ever such a thing. Then he held out the photograph. In it was a boy, no older than 10, hair curling slightly over his forehead, eyes bright with a smile so unguarded it felt like it belonged to another world entirely. Ethan's voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of years. It was his son, he said, the child he had raised from infancy until life had taken an unforgiving turn. 5 years ago, the boy's mother's family had fought for custody and won. They had the means, the influence, and the legal grounds to take him abroad. Ethan had been left with nothing but this photograph and the hope that one day, against every odd, he would find his son again. He explained that the job in Julian's home was not just about the income, though he needed it. It was about staying close to children, reminding himself of the role he had once played and the love that had not faded, even with distance. It was about keeping that part of himself alive, the part that refused to give up on finding his boy. Julian took the photograph, meaning only to look politely, but as his eyes settled on the child's face, something inside him jolted. He knew that smile, not from meeting the boy in person, but from the adoption profiles he had reviewed last year, searching for the child who would become his son. Among them had been this same face captured in the same photograph, part of a file he had studied before ultimately choosing the boy who now slept peacefully in the crib between them. The room seemed to still around them. Julian lifted his eyes to meet Ethan's, and in that silent exchange, both men understood the unlikeliness of what had just been revealed. This was no coincidence. The paths that had carried them to this point, Julian's guarded search for a family, Ethan's quiet persistence had crossed with an inevitability neither could have predicted. For Julian, well, the realization shifted something fundamental. What had begun as a single night's arrangement was no longer a matter of convenience. It was the start of something neither of them had dared to imagine, a chance to rebuild a sense of family from the ashes of loss. Not by design, but by fate. For Ethan, it was proof that even in the vast and indifferent weave of life, some threads found their way back together. As the baby stirred and blinked awake, both men moved closer to the crib, their hands brushing for the briefest moment on the railing. No promises were spoken, no plans made, but the air between them was different now, charged not with uncertainty, but with the fragile beginnings of trust. Life rarely delivers answers in the way we expect. Sometimes it offers something better, the right people, at the right time, with the courage to stay. And when it does, the choice is whether we recognize the moment before it passes. If you were in Julian's place, standing in that nursery with the truth unfolding in your hands, what would you do next? Stay with Heart Stories for more stories where chance, loss, and hope intertwine into something unforgettable.